Ricardo, and hello everyone online and here today at McMaster University. My name is Jennifer Ditcherin. I am the President and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Last year, when we were starting to organize this event series, we asked 9 different policy schools to provide us with an emerging public policy issues that they thought that decision makers and policymakers should be focused on. The theme that Vass and her team and students chose at McMaster, Health Tech, the Politics and Policies of Remote Rehabilitation, has resonance for us at the IRPP as we celebrate our 50th anniversary this year. We were created after the federal government identified the need to have an independent institute that could provide in-depth research on a range of topics with long-term scope. One of the issues that it specifically mentioned all those years ago was information technology. And over the years, the way that the digital world is reshaping the economy and society has come up time and time again. In 1980, just as one example, we had a research program on society and technology. And out of that emerged a book by Heather Menzies called Women and the Chip on the, quote, question of present and foreseeable impacts of office automation on employment and women. And that book went into 3 reprints. And let me just read you a line from the 1985 IRPP publication, Computer Communications in the Mass Market in Canada, not like the most exciting title. Quote, services which evolve from computer communications technology will transform Canadian society if widespread usage of the technology is achieved. So that seems quite cute now, but that was what was on the horizon back in the 1980s. So innovation and equity and inclusion in health tech is what's on the horizon now. And we're so delighted to collaborate with the Master in Public Policy and Digital Society program at Master University here on this particular topic. I'll now introduce Clifton Van der Linden, the Academic Director of the Master of Public Policy program at McMaster University and Director of the Digital Society Lab.
Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à l'Université McMaster. C'est un grand plaisir d'accueillir aujourd'hui l'Institut de recherche en politique publique. On behalf of the Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program here at McMaster University, I am honored to welcome the Institute for Research on Public Policy. For the past 50 years, the IRPP has been generating research, providing insight, and informing debate on current and emerging policy issues facing Canadians and their governments. Throughout changing tides and shifting tides, the Institute has been a steadfast source of independent, evidence-based policy analysis, of which we are all beneficiaries. As we look to the complex policy issues that lay ahead of us, I take comfort in knowing that the IRPP will continue to help us navigate the challenges on the horizon. I'm also delighted that the IRPP has partnered with McMaster's Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program as part of its pan-Canadian tour of major schools of public policy. The Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program is Canada's newest and only specialized graduate degree offering in public policy, recognizing the central role that digital technologies play in 21st century policymaking. Given the prominence of digital or digital adjacent issues on the IRPP's policy radar, the need for graduate training at the intersection of digital and policy leadership is a critical contribution toward ensuring that Canada is well equipped to address the opportunities and challenges of the future. I'd like to take a moment to thank Jennifer Ditcherin, as well as Judy Manny, Clea Desjardins, Les Perot, and everyone on the IRPP team for their work translating important policy opportunities to a wide audience. I also want to thank McMaster's Anna Maria Skirtic and Patrick Brennan for their planning and support with this conversation today. Finally, I have the privilege of introducing today's moderator for our panel discussion, Eva Salinas. Eva is an accomplished journalist with an impressive record of media leadership, both in Canada and abroad. She has worked for the Times of London, the BBC, the Globe and Mail, and is a former editor of the Santiago Times in Chile and former managing editor of the award-winning foreign affairs site, Open Canada. She is presently the executive producer for CBC Hamilton, as well as a journalism instructor and prominent advocate in the Hamilton community for human rights, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Eva, on behalf of the Master of Public Policy Program in Digital Society and McMaster University, it is my pleasure to welcome you as moderator of today's panel discussion.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Hello to everyone. This is a new era of beautiful hybrid events, so I'll be looking in maybe a few directions and hope to capture the audiences. It's so fitting too, because what we're talking about today is accessibility of knowledge and information and care. So I'm really excited to be part of this discussion that's happening with an audience both online and here in person. I'd like to introduce our panelists here for this discussion. To my left, I have Dawn Bowdish. She's a professor at McMaster University here and holds the Canada Research Chair in Aging and Immunity. She is the executive director of the Firestone Institute of Respiratory Health. Her lab studies age-associated inflammation and how it relates to respiratory infections. She runs the preclinical studies in aging laboratory and is on the board of directors of the Lung Health Foundation. Welcome, Dawn. Thank you. Next is Rachel Bartholomew. She is the founder and CEO of Highiv Health. Highiv Health is focused on creating a medical device for women with pelvic-based cancers and diseases. She has worked as a lecturer in entrepreneurship for quantum computing, an analyst for a venture capital firm, an innovation manager at a large Canadian financial institution, and helped restart Laurier University's Startup Incubator program. Rachel founded and serves on the Advisory Council for Femtech Canada, and she's the host of the White Coat Warrior podcast. Welcome, Rachel. And last but not least, Vas Bedman. She is the executive director of the Master in Public Policy program here at McMaster and an adjunct lecturer in political science, also here at the university. She writes a newsletter about Canadian startups and public policy called Regs to Riches. Welcome, Vas. Thank you. Great. So I want to start with you, Dawn. Your research team has been working on remote respiratory rehabilitation care before and now during the pandemic. I'm wondering if you can just start by describing what this remote care looks like and how it differentiates from the standardized care that was offered before.
So obviously we've faced a lot of challenges now, so we've had to adapt, but historically rehabilitation for people with respiratory disease or respiratory or pulmonary rehabilitation can encompass things like getting out of that hospital bed, preparing someone for discharge from hospital. It can also include things like helping people deal with the symptoms that stop them from leading a full life. So for example, anyone who has respiratory issues might benefit from exercise training or for specific training exercises to help strengthen their lung capacity. It also now has also encompassed people who are challenging with long COVID. So many of the people who've recovered from COVID have syndromes that are associated with hospitalization. So for example, being on a ventilator or being in a hospital bed for a while, or also many of the long COVID symptoms include sort of fatigue or an inability to exercise. So we've got this huge range of symptoms ranging from improving people's quality of life and keeping them out of the hospital, but also from dealing with the costs of hospitalization or the costs of these chronic health conditions. In our previous world, I have to say, we were not very strong in doing things virtually. And I think that's a feature of the Canadian system in general. Many of our respiratory therapists and our experts here do feel that they get a lot from the human connection, from being able to see what a patient's doing, from being able to have quantitative measures of how that patient's doing. However, the pandemic did force us to shift. And so, although we'll speak to this in more details, many of our learnings have included the importance of having community-based respiratory therapy, having patient groups where people can share their own experiences, because so much of rehabilitation can often be sharing strategies that work and don't work. And sort of taking this whole person approach to helping people get back to whatever their goals are, be that getting back to work, be that getting back to school, be that extending or improving the quality of the life for terminal lung disease. So that's sort of the broad framework. And what we've had to do, of course, is move to situations where At first, we tried to make videos, that people could use on their own accord, and found that those actually weren't very successful. People need structure, timing. We also tried to make it scalable, instead of just having a group of 2 or 3 people, having something that we could have 20 or 30 people in. That also didn't work. The respiratory therapists really didn't feel that they could get a sense of what the individual was responding and couldn't deal with their particular health needs. And so our major learnings as we've shifted is that scalability is not necessarily an option. Our hope was that we would reach members of our community who traditionally would struggle, be they live out of our catchment area, be they people with socioeconomic challenges to physically getting to the area. And in fact, we found a little bit of the opposite. Without a lot of investment by companies and people who help create technologies, tablets that patients can use, the digital divide has been really very problematic in our approach. And so those are there's a summary on some of our major learnings that we've had.
But have there been some aspects that have been effective? And you mentioned, just getting the sense of those who are giving the care, but are you also being able to measure that effectiveness from patients themselves?
Yes, so some patients groups are really amenable to these sorts of therapies. And, to a certain degree, a lot of the psychosocial supports that are helpful for actually getting to a physical therapy are also super important for using virtual therapy effectively. So for example, having someone who could deal with your child care or elder care so you can participate, still really important, digital or non-digital. Having a relationship with somebody who you feel really cares about your health, people engaged in coming to the therapy. And so we have learned that for some people it's preferable, and really honestly, if I'm perfectly honest, the people we worry the most about are people who live outside of major academic centers. If you're blessed enough to live in the city, you can probably find a way to get to us. But if you're, somewhere in a rural area, we've known that the respiratory rehabilitation has just been incredibly uneven. And so those are the people that we still are working towards reaching out to and making sure that we can capture that.
Thanks. Well, I wonder with Highiv Health, how you've been able to connect, in the range of folks and where they are. Could you tell us a bit more about just the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, most definitely. So we've created a pelvic rehabilitation system for women who went through any sort of pelvic-based cancer, gynecological disease. So this could be anywhere from menopausal atrophy to postpartum tearing, all the way to cancers, endometriosis. And what we found was the current standard of care for aftercare after being diagnosed was 83 years old. It was created in 1938. Not much innovation had happened in that space. And there was like a 30% continuous rate of use. And if this standard of care wasn't used, people would end up back into the hospital systems. And the other standard of care beyond this product is this pelvic floor rehabilitation, which is a newer concept, unfortunately. It's only starting to get picked up now, but there's 5,400 therapists in all of North America. So when you get into these rural areas, they're just not there. And so we've had patients we've talked to that drive 5 hours to go and get care from a pelvic floor rehab. And unfortunately, what's happening is women are just continually having issues. There's no quick wins in our area of health. Pelvic health is something that needs to be maintained. It's often a roller coaster ride. I know this personally. And it's just something that has to be continually addressed, or else women are just going to continually have problems.
So can you walk us through it? So somebody is referred, from start to finish, how does it work? What exactly is the care all about?
Yeah. So we have a device that is prescribed by a pelvic floor physiotherapist or an OBGYN. Essentially what happens is a patient will come in, they'll get cleared for use of the device. They will be set up on the device and trained, and then they take it home with them. Our pelvic floor physios or OBGYNs can remote patient monitor what they're doing from home, if they're making progress, and if they need to intervene in that progress. So we kind of have this red flag, orange flag, and green flag in terms of intervening with those patients. And essentially the patient goes home, uses the device. So it does a dilation therapy, which is stretching the muscles and the tissues in that area. It is heating, so kind of like a heating pad for other areas of your body. Same sort of concept down in the gynecological area. And then we're doing cooling and self-lubrication. And with all of these therapies, we're combining it with biosensors. And so we're tracking some of the first data points in the pelvic floor area. We're already starting to see really interesting data that we don't even know what it means. So we've pulled up our socks and we're getting into clinical trials to really understand what that data means. And introducing this data has never been done before in this space. And so that's what's unlocked this remote monitoring and remote connection to the clinician while keeping patients from home and keeping more patients on the Rolodex. Most of the therapists we talk to have 1 year plus long waiting lists of getting patients in to see them. Women's College Hospital, 7-year long waiting list. So it is dire for women. There's about 50 million in North America. And yet, if you have 5,400 therapists, you've got maybe 1,000 patients per doctor, which pretty much impossible to handle and take care of. So one step in the right direction in getting data as a part of this conversation.
So not only are you getting new data points and new parts of care, but the remote or at-home aspect is key to it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. And how is it paid privately, or how does that work for patients?
Yeah, so right now we're going through clinicals and we're going to be actually commercializing next year. Our goal is to get it reimbursable. There are some codes out there currently to get the device covered. Unfortunately, they're not great. So part of my policy work that I'm working on is trying to figure out how to get it covered by the government. It is covered in France, and try to figure out how to get better codes. We do this in respiratory, we do this in heart health, diabetes. Why can't we do it in pelvic floor rehabilitation? There's great coverage for the therapists and their remote patient monitoring. This is a new concept, thanks to COVID, that's starting to get adopted into the insurance community. So things are starting to work in the right direction.
Great, and I want to hear more about the France model shortly, but Dawn, would you agree, or to what extent do you think OHIP coverage is important here for these technologies and remote care?
This is so crucial. My demographic, people living with chronic lung disease, it is got a huge socioeconomic divide. I mean, when we think about all the factors associated with chronic lung disease, smoking, pollution, stress, all of these things have such a strong socioeconomic divide. And I have to say, COVID has only really exacerbated that, because now, of course, we're looking at people sometimes more frequently we're in precarious employment, who are dealing with all the consequences of this. So to have an equitable society, we have to have options other than private care. I mean, some of us who work at McMaster have a lovely insurance plan that comes with it, but that is not the truth for many of our participants. So from our system, if you are still in the hospital, you have actually very good access to care. Where it becomes problematic, so for example, we had a respiratory rehabilitation specifically to get people ready for lung transplants. Not very many centers had this ability, so people had to come out of the catchment area. Money does not travel in that way, the way we've set this up in the province of Ontario. And so it was a lost leader. And eventually that program got canceled. So we have to really think about where money flows and who is putting forth these monies. A lot of it, I have to be perfectly frank, many of our participants and our patients who have technology that they need to do their rehab, it all comes from corporate sponsorship, because a lot of people can't afford this. And again, when we think about scalability, we will not be able to rely forevermore on the generosity of these corporate sponsors. And so really understanding how money flows and how to get this equitable resources to people, I think is just so essential and so problematic in our current system.
And with the corporate sponsorship and even just care in general, how are you finding your patients are learning about what's possible and what's available to them?
Again, if they don't already have a really good primary care physician, or they aren't in a tertiary care center, they're not.
Yeah.
We have currently only 1%, less than 1%, 0.5% of people with COPD are actually in any sort of therapy program, even though it's been shown to extend life, decrease hospitalization. increased function, increasing abilities, a person's ability to stay in the workplace. I mean, less than 1%, it's ridiculous. So these are the sorts of challenges that if we truly want a healthy society, we have to address. And we can, like I said, we cannot rely on these makeshift measures, corporate sponsorship, people's work plans being able to pay for that, especially with older adults who are often past retirement age. So these are challenges that I hope our policy colleagues will really start to address, because it makes a huge impact on quality of life.
Well, and Vas, I want to ask you on the barriers to this kind of innovation and you know, further accessibility, but maybe fill us in on the France example on how they're innovating first, and then we can get to maybe, you know, what's preventing Canada to follow suit.
Yeah, so pelvic health, lots of stigma, right? Women's health in general, we're just not there yet with not just pelvic health, heart health, everything. And so with this stigma comes vastly different, you know, ideologies across cultures, across age groups, across everything, across countries. And funny enough, North America, we're not even there yet in terms of being on the cusp or on the border of being an innovative, forward-thinking society in pelvic health. France is. They're one of the only countries that have actually adopted pelvic health into coverage that their country provides. And what they do is they have 6 sessions up front before a woman gives birth, that's covered through a physiotherapist, and 6 sessions after giving birth. And it's been proven to keep women out of the hospital, lack of symptoms in terms of prolapse and all these things you see after giving birth, and even multiple times. And it works. And yet somehow this concept just doesn't seem to move forward into other countries. And my personal journey is to get this awareness, especially here in Canada, because we do have a system that can support that.
And that's anyone who gives birth, whether it's in the hospital or with a midwife, or they just get, you know, you get connected somehow to the care.
You have a baby, you get the care.
What do you think, Vas, is preventing that kind of innovation here?
I mean, look, I'm working on the policy strategy in my beautiful notebook as we chat. I mean, I think one of the, there's competing aspects right now that we're talking about. One is also just the discoverability, not just the discoverability of this issue, but given that this product exists and could provide some relief and rehabilitation, how do you even find it in the first place? So we've touched on, how do you get it referred to you officially? How do you get it paid for? Is there a third role somewhere, just in terms of, is there a curatorial role to say, these are tools and interventions that are available to you, even if you're just paying out of pocket for them? That's not a big P or small p policy. That's just, how do you even find out, you know, what opportunities there are? There's an opaqueness. Another is also the aspect related to consumer protection, to privacy, if you're paying out of pocket, right? But what this is fundamentally showing us is how much closer public policy people, decision makers, need to be working with our innovators and entrepreneurs and researchers, right? The model is changing. It needs to be, I need a better cliche, hand in glove, because they're both identifying problems and coming up with solutions, but we need to kind of pave that regulatory pathway together. You use the term medical device. That's a really important term in Canada. The recognition of a tool being recognized as a medical device by Health Canada, and I don't want to make it too boring, is, you know, there's a very productive kind of gatekeeping function that the federal government plays. A gatekeeping function that we don't see with digital technologies, and arguably that's why so many digital technologies cause, you know, more harms than they help. But at the same time, those thresholds, there are certain, again, digital tools and otherwise that fall outside of that category, don't have standards, and are otherwise masquerading as medical devices. So what I would love to see, and in terms of what some of those challenges and blockers are, I would love to see a research partnership here at McMaster University with Highiv, with, you know, consent of patients, using these data points, maybe making it accessible, you know, to many other researchers, and starting to say, what are we learning? What else do we need? Because this is also a future of work. This is job creation. This is who the university needs to be training to help these kinds of people with rehabilitation. There's so many kind of issues intertwined that are fascinating and that are important and that are urgent. But again, the discoverability, we fail if we cannot just identify what is that opportunity and what's the problem? And I'm fascinated by the France example. You know, what went into making that policy decision that we've been lurking around since 1938? What information did they even have in 1938? Anyway,
Yeah.
Those are some of my thoughts.
Well, and another challenge that I'm sure you could all speak to, but are you finding there's a gendered lens here to this work?
Absolutely.
Dawn?
So, I mean, again, my focus being on chronic health, lung health, there's always been gender differences in outcomes for sure, even in diagnosis. And then when we think about implementation, especially in the context of older adults, one's partner is often one's caregiver in these situations too, right? So what we end up seeing is that just as if you have childcare challenges, you may also have elder care challenges in attending your rehab and these sorts of things. The other sort of very gendered aspect is that one of the reasons the outcome is less positive in women is because they are less likely to be referred to various different things or to be referred to specific technologies. Their symptomology is a little bit different. So if there's sort of a checklist about what might happen, women and men might have a slightly different trajectory along their path of health. So, I mean, one of our major learnings has been that there are more older women because women live longer. And so at the very extreme end of life, we have a lot more women in those situations. And we need to support them in being able to access technology, obviously, and being able to help give them long, healthy years, being able to help their caregiver, be it a partner or a child or someone else, bring them along this journey of rehabilitation with them. And that includes things like not putting your rehab hours during someone's working day, right? That person may not work, but their caregiver may work. And that takes a lot of strain on the system. I mean, one of the #1 reasons people retire early is to care for a loved one with a chronic health condition. So if we want to keep people in the workforce, especially in that sort of older middle-aged demographic, what we really need to do is think about making things like caregiving easier. Virtual rehabilitation has huge potential, but we have to keep in mind there are restraints as well. And this sort of work-life flexibility that we've all grown to love is really important in caring for your loved one as they get older.
Well, and I want to bring up a theme that comes up often with virtual care, which maybe those in the audience are also thinking about, which I would like to just remind, or I haven't said right from the beginning, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, those online and here in the audience. So we will, towards the end of the conversation shortly, have a space. So if you do have some questions or want to give that some thought, you are welcome to. But the idea of information and privacy. So as we're saying, let's make sure these technologies are accessible and equitable, but that we're going in that direction. Vaz, what can you tell us already about how information is being protected now and where it needs to go, or what we need to think about as we move forward?
Well, I mean, I have a great deal of trust in terms of when research is being conducted at or by a hospital, you know, at universities, that we have really robust frameworks in place to protect that data, protect access to that information. But I think we can also miss opportunities to collect, you know, valuable information from interventions like the ones that we're talking about. And we can also kind of forget that we have these strange gaps that exist in our regulatory realities. This is something we study a lot in the program, right? So if you access healthcare privately in Canada, which many do in a range of ways, especially with the growth of health technologies, remote care, because of a little tiny policy change from 1991, what a throwback, you won't be covered under consumer protection. But it's something that you're purchasing. Now, it's not totally unregulated. It's not a Wild West. I'm using the worst cliches because, you know, they're regulated by the colleges, right? But it still creates a murkiness where it's kind of like, who's responsible for this and who cares and who has oversight? So that's, I think, policymakers' role fundamentally, to be responsive and agile. I think we expect a responsive and increasingly responsive state. Here's one of the big problems. The compute power of our governance institutions has not even seen a step increase from, forget 1938, 1991. And yet we have more and more new things, new devices, new technologies, new problems. And in fact, the legislature sits for less days. We pass less pieces of legislation. So how do we get those how do we tinker? How do we keep a responsive state and kind of innovate in that way? That's something that fundamentally hurts us, right? Hurts us as a society. I had one other thought in my head that I wanted to bring forward. Oh, what does this mean for the future of work? The people who work in the space, we've heard they're waitless, people are having trouble getting connected. I don't know how these rehabilitation specialists that you mentioned are regulated. I suspect many of them are provincial in nature. Well, does it make sense now that somebody from Hamilton could provide rehabilitation advice to someone in Halifax? And for Canada, is this one of our very unique opportunities going forward? Should that person be forced to or penalized? You know, should they pay 2 premiums? Or can we start to see some regulatory homogeneity? I don't know what we want to call it, but can we set a standard to say, we will recognize that credential here because this is going to unlock care opportunities for people where people can, you know, live and work anywhere. That kind of stuff makes me excited. But of course, I remain concerned about that fundamental mismatch between, again, the compute power of our governance institutions and just the volume and intricateness of the challenges that we want to sink our teeth into.
If we're seeing more private actors or corporate actors in the space to balance out or push forward with innovation, you know, you mentioned that you have confidence in the safeguards in place for information at a research institute level. Does the same apply when they work together? What are your thoughts there on?
That's when I personally revert to my norm of healthy skepticism / assuming that everything's a scam and working from there, which has served me well. I say that with, you know, partially as a joke, but also to kind of keep the kind of scrutiny we deserve. Look, companies are having trouble scaling when it comes to health tech in Canada. They're typically selling elsewhere. We can view that as a loss to Canada from an intellectual property perspective, from keeping innovation here, and it absolutely is. What do we have to learn from that? But also, is there something to celebrate? Is there something that's working in terms of back to gatekeeping? It's not just regulatory gatekeeping. There's access to markets. That's a form of gatekeeping, right? Whether you're able to procure with a hospital. And again, now I'm speaking a little bit more in a digital, you know, not just device, but a digital service, or helping people. I'm forgetting the name of the company, I'm so sorry, but you know, recently in the Globe and Mail basically sold a technology that instead of making you download a CD-ROM of your x-ray, I'm oversimplifying it. Do you know the company? Can you say it? You can download it online. You pay $5 and get it online and access it anywhere. Great innovation. People are paying out of pocket. It's a modest fee. It's a form of privatization. It saves the hospital a lot of money. You know, there are these wins and then there are these losses. So how do we start to think about that? I fear I've deviated too much from your original question. Do I have the trust? Lastly, you know, these companies might be, you know, subject to an exit pathway that's very productive for some, but for others, you know, killer acquisitions where they become part of other companies and are absorbed, and maybe the use of the information fundamentally changed. But again, it goes to where there's murkiness and where health information is regulated in different ways than other kinds of information. So what's health and what's not? That's one of our blurriest items right now. And it's perhaps best exemplified by, I don't know if anyone's, yes, wearing an Apple Watch on YouTube. You've got the ring. Okay, perfect. With our powers combined. So, you know, Apple has a partnership with a Toronto hospital to do some research on the cardiac effects, but I don't know all the details, but it is otherwise positioning itself as a medical device or as a proxy for a medical device, but again, not regulated as one under the existing framework that we have, not subject to the oversight and testing. So is that good for innovation? Do we want to just keep moving forward? Or, you know, how do we either update what a medical device is? Should there be a kind of digital medical device? The other challenge there, back to compute power, that's never going to be a top 5 priority for almost anyone, but it would be such a productive and meaningful intervention. So again, how do we get there? And how do we recognize the cascade? It's not just one, there's not one, and sorry, because it's a lot of work for you, but there's not just one change for Highiv that's going to kind of get us there, but it's this hopefully very interesting full court press that you can mobilize more people around. Yeah.
Well, and there's just so much to dive into, and all these, you know, even just the idea of, you know, how we're classifying medical devices, as you
Right.
said, you know, is there an opportunity there? Because if they are, you know, then there's safeguards in place that come with that. You know, but I want to make sure before we do get to some questions that we maybe just go around and just give kind of some thoughts, just so that we're really getting to the core of the issue here in how these technologies can help us overcome health inequities, because we know that it's mixed results right now, but you know, where do you see it going forward, and how can they be a help? What do we need to consider as we go forward? Dawn, can I start with you?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly the digital divide is very real. Most of our participants don't have access to a steady internet that they need or a device that they can access it. So as I mentioned, we've turned to corporate collaborations and partnerships to help ready that, and I'm extremely grateful for that. But how, moving forward, do we deal with this? And certainly older adults in general often rely on the younger people in their lives to help them navigate these. This is going to be a moving target as we sort of collectively age in an environment that's more comfortable with this. So those are two really important digital divide issues. But you know, one of the other things is having integrated care that sees the whole person, because many of the people who we see who have these chronic health conditions have other issues, mobility issues, you know, working odd hours issues, all sorts of whole person issues that they respond the best to care when those are all treated with. So despite the fact that we can use this virtual technology, we definitely see more buy-in when there's a human touch, even if it's just a personalized phone call discussion with your provider. So it's not a matter of completely taking the human out of the situation. The human actually increases compliance, the human commitment to the program. People finish more if they feel that they have these relationships. So keeping in mind technology, but also the human touch, I think speaks to the social beings that we are.
Absolutely. Rachel?
To that point, they say 51% of clinicians worry that empathy in remote patient monitoring and any sort of telemedicine is lacking. And that human touch is so important to us as well. When you create a technology in this space and you realize all the intricate players involved, you cannot eliminate the clinician. Anyone who tries to eliminate the clinician is doing it the wrong way. It is so important to have that human element, have that empathy associated with it, and have that kind of second party to review all this stuff. I have so many comments from everything that was said. I think part of what I want to highlight is consumers don't understand what medical devices are. We go through a lot, and for a proper reason. It's for safety, it's for efficacy. Health Canada, FDA, all these entities exist. We're going through a clinical trial right now with McMaster, and we have to go through detailed data analysis and how we're storing and where it's being stored and what is HIPAA compliant. And you turn to a consumer and they cannot tell the difference between FDA registered and FDA approved. And that's scary. And unfortunately, a lot of innovations, especially in our space, have taken advantage of that. And what we've seen is patients buying these devices that are not safe, that are not cleared, that are using data, like you said, being skeptical, data that is made up. It doesn't mean anything. And yet patients think, oh, I'm making progress, or oh, I'm, you know, whatever, or I'm not making progress. And it goes into a drawer after that 15 days, you're proven to get results. That's not how this works. And so I think part of it is consumers learning more about this, being skeptical of your data and what it's being used for. I think it's a huge hurdle for us companies to get through in terms of that, what that data means. Like for us as a class 2 medical device, we can state what our sensors are doing and what the readings are. We cannot tell you what those readings mean beyond. And that's when a clinician has to come in and give their professional opinion. If you go beyond that, you have to do years, millions of dollars worth of clinical trials. And so it is, but it's there for a reason. And the companies that go through that piece of it, it's so, so important to understand the lengths that we will go to make proper companies. Now, the one thing I will say, innovation in Canada is so tough. for healthcare companies getting adopted into the healthcare systems. I sat on a panel with a bunch of really, really big companies, one that you see driving down the 401 on the right-hand side in Mississauga, who said that 5% of their customers are in Canada and the 95% is elsewhere.
Oh.
And that's because we've set up all of these things to help innovation get through clinical trials, through research, and then when it comes to procurement and adoption, it stops right there because the clinicians don't have the budget, they can't make the decisions. How do you choose an innovation over bare necessities to take care of a patient? That's where the technology doesn't get adopted, and we have to start to think about the ways that we are helping our clinicians adopt these innovations into their hospital systems. So
I think we might be ready for some questions from the audience. Do we want to start with one from online?
Sure. So one participant online asked, I would love the speakers to ask specifically about scalability and maintenance of their innovative programs.
Great. Dawn, and I mean, I'm sure you all could speak to, you want to start?
Sure. So sustainability and maintenance is obviously key. And the questions that we're sort of asking ourselves now are, what are we keeping from this? What have we learned and what are we going to change? And what do we need to continue to adapt to? And I mean, I think for us in the respiratory field, the looming threat used to be just demographic change. That used to be the big looming threat that, you know, there was going to be such a huge requirement for this. Now the looming threat is demographic change plus long COVID and all the health consequences of that. And so we're going to have to start adapting really quickly. So I think for us, a big part of the sustainability is actually advocacy, you know, making sure that we do these, we get into these trials right now, because with respiratory rehabilitation, the closer you are to the event, be it an exacerbation of your chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or hospitalization for COVID, the sooner you start, the better the outcome is for that participant. And because we don't have a lot of data about what works right now in this wave of long COVID or the intersection between lung disease and COVID, for us, before we even get to sustainability, we need to start presenting people with the evidence that this is going to be important for keeping people in the workforce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those aspects are there. The other aspects, like I said, are, you know, this corporate sponsorship for us is a huge problem. And so how are we going to convince policymakers in health, our health system, that we have to be able to provide devices for people and accept the fact that there's some attrition, loss, and destruction? You know, that'll just be part of the medical process. So that's sort of the looming and pressing weight upon those of us in the field of respiratory rehabilitation.
I think in terms of scalability and sustainability, education becomes a big piece of that. And it's not just education for the consumer or the patient, it's also education for the clinicians and the adoption of these systems and how it can help. And I think part of it is evidence, right? You have to go through not only the clinical trials from the patient efficacy side, but also, you know, there's something called health economic reports, right? You go and you learn about how does this get adopted into a system? How does it impact the hospital system? How does it impact the clinician? And how can we make their lives easier? Because they are swamped, they're busy, they have a lot to do, and they have a lot of patients to take care of. And so adding one more thing becomes, oh goodness, now I gotta, you know, do this and do that. So how do you make it so simplified and have those proven results that come out of it? And all that is just pulling up your socks and really going through proper ways to get the evidence behind your innovations and the numbers that don't lie. That's really how you scale it from the clinician side. I think for us, it's education to the patients and learning more about just how these devices help, as well as education on how they can get connected to those clinicians.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just quickly pick up on something you just said, right? Proper ways. What Rachel is pointing to is legitimate pathways to responsible innovation. And, you know, what those hoops are, where they exist, where they're productive, and where they're kind of a blocker, because maybe that's some of the question too. What are these blockers to the scalability? What we want to avoid are clinicians being incentivized, perhaps improperly, to prescribe or refer. You know, that's frankly, that's a scalability strategy. It's not one I endorse, but it exists, and we've seen it elsewhere, you know, in particular in the United States. And I think those are aspects that the Canadian system fundamentally wants to avoid, but certainly our system needs to think about how and when are we going to productively incorporate legitimate and trusted medical devices into care? Because what we've been hearing in both these instances is that it's part of that continuum of care. It's not a substitution. It's not, if you have this, you don't need a clinician. You'll never have to speak to one again. It's complementary. And I think that's really, really encouraging. And it's going to be the future of healthcare in Canada. Great.
Yeah, before I go on to the next online question, I'd invite participants in the room to approach the mic on either side, and I'll alternate between you guys and the online questions. So Jennifer online asks, the idea of remote assessment is so important. How can this be feasible, taking into consideration financials, language, digital competency for individuals, and how can therapists remote monitoring in their practice?
Yeah, such an important question. Yeah, and we haven't even touched on language. I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many different factors, right? I mean, we've mentioned just on the combination still of the human factor needed, you know, somebody there, but would you like to?
Well, I guess I just speaking to the language issue, this is another question when it comes to online versus in-person. Rehabilitation has a lot of showing, right? This is how you do this exercise. This is what it should feel like, or laying hands on the person, you know, you should feel this here, you should feel this there. And so one of the workarounds that our group has always had with people where English language is not their first language or they don't have a good translator is the fact that so much of it is actually physical. And you can show instead of telling, and you know, you can draw pictures, you can provide pictures and things like that. And so this actually, the language barrier is not trivial. And I think, you know, we as Canadians are great. You often see, you know, medical providers saying which languages they speak. And in our center, we have, you know, lists of nurses and things like that who can work as translators and people who can help address some of those comprehension issues. But then it also becomes a challenge when you have people with dementia or have some cognitive impairments, and how do you make sure that it becomes a family issue? And again, working with the community, the person's community is so important in these issues. So I'm really glad that question was brought up, because I think it is really important to understand that many of us find it harder to communicate with people who we don't share a native language with when we're online. Certainly in teaching, it's found that that's to be the case. So, I mean, that's just another really important consideration, making culturally sensitive language materials.
Well, and on the digital literacy, you mentioned, you know, just on the education in general, and that I assume is, you know, both the medical terminology that you mentioned that's changing, but, you know, continuing efforts on digital literacy. How have you found anything to speak to on just getting people into the place they need to be on how to use technology?
It's tough because age plays a huge role in this. It's nice that now our generations are starting to catch up with this technology and understand it, but you know, we go as far in our focus groups to say, what text size can you read, right? It's those basic things. The lovely thing about digital technology is that you can adapt and adopt in different languages and have that translation in there. And part of what we have to do for regulatory approvals and that type of thing is to have these things in our labeling as well. So when you go through a medical device status, you have to have all that labeling, the instructions, everything, all the warnings and stuff in those languages. So I think another big point to this is not only culture and language, but also, you know, LGBTQ and how we present that in this type of care. Age becomes a big factor as well. I call our women that use our product the quiet rebellious ones. They're not the ones that are out there screaming rah, rah, rah. They're actually love what those people are doing, but want to quietly kind of keep to themselves in terms of their issues that they're going through. So understanding those changes and having options, I think, is a big thing. Having text to audio to video and having those different elements that they can use really do help with that adoption.
For sure. So making sure people, it's accessible and that all bodies and ages feel welcome and that the care is for them.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, Les?
I'm like not smart enough on this topic. I'm taking notes from both of you. No, perfect points. And I think back to the importance of standards, you know, that curational function to say, actually, this, you know, can be provided in your language of choice, or, you know, you have those options. And of course, the digital literacy piece, absolutely.
Mhm. We have time for one or two more?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So Liz from online asked, I would love to hear the panelists discuss how virtual care may reinforce existing inequities, particularly for northern and remote communities where high-speed internet doesn't exist or is prohibitively expensive. What is the role for people in the health field to advocate for connectivity and infrastructure, which is far from our normal playground?
What an important question.
Super important.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to the work that you've done so far?
Sure. Well, I mean, this weighs on me. I think in our field of respiratory health, there is no way of not seeing the incredible socioeconomic inequities in these diseases. And what upsets me is that not only if you are somebody who has, you know, low socioeconomic class or all these socioeconomic aspects, if you're indigenous, if you're, you know, any number of factors that might predispose you to the disease itself. But then even if we take everyone who's got that disease and we split them up by socioeconomic status, who does better? Well, it's the people of higher economic status because they have these private plans they can get their therapy from. They, you know, or tend to be more comfortable navigating the healthcare system. This sort of adds up. So it's a double whammy, both in getting the disease and then in dealing with the disease. And so as much as it feels very compelling that virtual rehabilitation and virtual tools may help overcome those divides. We've spoken already about the issues with access and the issues of not seeing your community reflected. So creating culturally sensitive materials that speak to the way your community deals with that disease or whatever and whatnot. And I do worry that until we have an equally literate population, and when it comes to electronic therapies, that we will actually be part of the problem.
Yeah. Do you think, Mass, that the healthcare system or practitioners or research institutes then, I think as the question was also asking, need to be part of that policy ask around internet connectivity and accessibility?
Absolutely. It's got to be a full court press. I think something we've seen in the pandemic is for people who are limited in their ability to access connectivity, pay for connectivity, have reliable and affordable connectivity. Are you being left out of what is now Canadian society, right? Being online used to be something you did now and then. You maybe had one family computer in a house. That has totally changed and shifted and been completely revolutionized. And, we've still, or for a period of time, we lost those critical third spaces as well, right? People coming maybe to campus, even going to libraries, going to McDonald's with their 24/7, they're open and they have free Wi-Fi and being able to access the internet in that way. By no means am I suggesting that is a solution to the issues we have in the North of Canada, just pointing to how people had some workarounds and those were also taken away. So yes, that needs to remain a priority in Canada. And even when we get to those high penetration statistics where we're kind of like, oh, 94%, and that's not the exact stat. So I'm sorry that I said, I know it's like that high. The 6% is actually quite a few people. So long way of saying absolutely. And it goes to, that transversal approach that we need and how we need to be connecting dots to so many concurrent issues that come out of just talking about, one medical device or, one form of respiratory rehabilitation illustrates so much.
I think we have one question from the audience.
Wow.
Yep.
This is a very exciting possibility for incubation, I think, and full disclosure, I speak as a surgeon who works here in the healthcare system. And understand that we, the clinician, are not the gatekeepers in the healthcare system. You're talking about your research endeavors and your data that you lead to clinicians to get buy-in and scalability. Not going to happen because we don't control the system. I don't look at my patient and say, what is the best, safest, most effective technology for this case? I say, what technology do I have and how can I best apply it to scrape through? So Vass mentioned linking research to the incubator before, and you should do that. Rehab care in some ways is a kind of preventative care, and effective research or product initiation is going to have to come from the link to government. And you're never going to get it from government by saying, this is going to cost so much. You're going to get it from going to government to saying, this is going to save you so much. So do the studies with high money, no corporate. Do them comparatively to the lack of that rehab or preventive care, and come to government and say, look, if we do this, we're going to save you so many $1 million a year. They don't care so much about admissions or respiratory flow rates or oxygen costs. They're going to care about money. And until we as a nation are ready to be that blunt and target our research that way, we're never going to change things. So please do this. I beg you.
That's your question. Okay. Well, nice.
It's such a good point. You go through setting up research, and I personally developed my product because I had cervical cancer. I am now going through vulva cancer. I'm making it for me, and I understand the impacts and all what unfortunately is considered the fluffy stuff, the quality of life and the happiness and blah, 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 blah. That impacts a person every single day. And I had that tough pill when I sat down and I had a whole, discussion with the hospital systems and the government, and they're like, show me the money, show me the money, show me that I don't want to pay anything out of pocket. What is this going to save me? And if it breaks even, maybe, but it better be compelling. It better save me money or make me money. And it's such a hard pill to swallow as a patient and also as a patient advocate, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so it's such a great point what you brought up. I'm glad you brought it up. Thank you.
Do you mind if I speak to that as well?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're so correct. I mean, it's funny because our clinical staff and our rehab therapists, they did not get into their jobs to save the healthcare system money. They came to help people, and they find it personally very upsetting when it's framed as an economic argument, because that is not what gets them out of bed every morning. However, we must be pragmatic. So I think some of the messages we need to think about too are not just hospitalization costs, healthcare costs, although certainly in the context of chronic disease, that is the next big pandemic that we will be sorting out. But also, keeping people in work for longer. Like I said, one of the reasons people retire early is caregiving. And there is actually a labor shortage in many parts of the country, especially in skilled sectors. And so having sort of middle-aged people, the 50+ crowd, leave the workforce early is actually tremendously costly. And so it's not just cost to the healthcare sector, I would argue, but cost to our employment sector and other sectors, and also framing the innovation and the incredible behindness that Canada has had in some of these is also an employment issue. So I think depending on which level of government and who you're speaking to, there's actually lots of great arguments for these things, including keeping older adults in the workforce for longer and taking that burden off of families who have to pay for sort out elder care as well as child care. So there's lots of good messages, and the economic one, I completely agree with our question asker, is the only one that's actually going to move that dial, not the quality of life.
Great. Well, that's an important note to end on as well. And I want to thank the three of you, Don, Rachel, Vass. I want to thank everyone and the organizers for the invitation. And this has been a really great conversation, and I'm sure, will be ongoing. And so thanks for all your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Eva, also for the great moderating. I feel like I learned heaps from a topic that I didn't know very much about before. And I love where we ended up with the final question, because it really demonstrates how cross-cutting, there's politics, there's the health transfer is like sort of overarching, which we'll see next week's budget if there's anything there. And it sort of filters down from the amount of the health transfer, what's in the system, the strains on the system, all the way down to the clinical level and what you're seeing in your company, Rachel, and lessons learned there. So it was a really fantastic conversation. And I also wanted to say really loved, Vass, what you said about needing that closer relationship between policymakers and researchers and innovators, which is really what our raison d'etre is at the IRPP as well, like bringing the voices together so they hear each other and they go back to their workplaces and advance. And that's really where the policy progress and the policy magic happens, is when people come together and they're not in their separate worlds. So thank you very much. And I really enjoyed all the discussion around digital inclusion, which is when we talk about connectivity, it's not just about connecting people in remote areas, not even remote areas. Let's be frank. It's not, you know, there's a lot of areas that are zones where you can't have decent Wi-Fi. It's not just about connecting people to better jobs. It's also fundamentally also about connecting to healthcare. Anyway, that was a fantastic conversation. I want to thank again McMaster University, Vas Bednar, Clifton Van der Linden, and the whole team that you have here. Thank you for hosting us with the IRPP here at the university. For those of you watching online, thank you for everyone who's here in the audience, but for those of you watching online, please fill out the evaluation form because we like to hear from you and understand how we can do better at our events. And on that note, our next event will be on long-term care, featuring Quebec Health and Welfare Commissioner Joanne Castonguay on April 19th. Ça va être en français, cet événement-là. Everyone's welcome to attend that online. And you can keep track of our events by checking out our website, irpp.org. And we will be having others in this series as the year unfolds. So we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you. Thanks again.